generally speaking, Tory, we've talked about this before, but the premise here is that we're, living through a time, I think everybody can agree, we have a lot of escalating crises happening. We're surrounded by a lot of narratives rooted in like our worst fears, things we don't really want to carry forward. But there's this question that we're holding that I think Grist is doing a really good job, and that you're doing a great job with this climate fiction series, of what happens when we, instead of choosing this, like the dystopian narratives, we let ourselves hold space for hope, for storytelling that leans into what is the world like when things that we're seeding actually blossom, like when this world actually grows, instead of, literally the opposite. So what's the power of that, and how can storytelling itself not just be like a nice to have, but part of our solutions as we're looking to the future? And honestly, now I think there's that silly movie trope of like the butterfly effect, where someone travels to the past, they sneeze on a dinosaur and the future is radically different. But we don't take that seriously when we think of ourselves, or like we could change something radically in the future if we just like shift how we're thinking and how we're moving today. So that was a little corny.
Yeah, no, but I'm gonna be thinking about sneezing on dinosaurs for like the next week now.
Yeah, I know, it's a little ridiculous. So thank you for being here. Just to get started, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about not just the Imagine 2200 initiative, but what brought you to climate fiction, like maybe even personally, because I feel like I've seen some climate fiction, but a lot of it is definitely on the more not as hopeful side, if I'm honest with you. Yeah. How would you introduce this?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting journey for myself. I started as a fundraiser and was a storyteller for many nonprofits for many years, and working for advocacy organizations, telling the stories of the folks that we were helping and the money that folks were donating. So, but the way I actually got here is that during the pandemic, I was charged with leading a conversation around how do we talk about climate fiction, and how do we want to talk about it at Grist. And so we explored that through a game that we developed just for the purpose of figuring this out. It was called Imagine 2200. It was a game, it was a visioning game, a visioning session. And it spanned actually 2 days. It was in the middle of the pandemic, or at the beginning of the pandemic, I should say. And it was wild to me, the visions that people were sharing. They were beautiful, they were just, they were focused on the future, in how do we get to a clean, green, and just future. And so, the thing that Grist wanted to know, the question we wanted to answer was, if we decide to launch a climate fiction initiative at Grist, what kind of initiative do we want that to be? And one of the things Grist has always been rooted in is telling stories that are not, that are stories that are hopeful, that are not doom and gloom. What are the solutions? What's the justice initiative here? Who's this going to help? Those kind of things. And so we knew we wanted climate fiction that resembled that. But because we had justice leaders at the table, it became much more than just those things. Those things I just mentioned are great, right? How do we help people? How do we make something that is not full of doom and gloom, but of hope and solutions? But the things that the justice leaders brought to the table that was more nuanced were things that I would consider in my past adjacent to climate. So reparations, the land back movement. And this is like, for me, I was less educated around these things. So I'm talking from a place of like, when I didn't know that the land back movement was essential to the climate movement. And so those justice leaders were like, you have to name check and bring in and educate people in the climate fiction world around these things, and have the stories and the characters be intersectional, and thinking about climate fiction, or thinking about in the world building, so that it's not just about the climate crisis, but it's so much more than that. It's, think of it as 4-dimensional instead of like 2D. Yeah, and so like I would say that, like in the beginning you said something around climate fiction being a part of a climate solution. I fully believe that climate fiction and climate storytelling is it's a climate solution that we need to use more. And so like, why do I say that it's a climate solution? I say that because people are moved by narratives and story, and that is how humans communicate and um, you know telegraph like what we want to do in the world, and help gather our people in so many things that stories can do. The stories are incredible, and so we use those things, but we're not using story as much as I think we should be to help us imagine how we get out of this climate crisis. And I think we could do that in spades. We could do that so much more. I always say this thing. I hope that we can have a million flowers bloom. And so what I mean is, I hope that we can have a million stories bloom around how do we get to the clean, green, just world that we want.
I love that. Yeah, I hear you on that because I mean, we're at Food Culture Collective where we started basically as a storytelling organization. So I'm like, yeah, everything you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. But I do feel like in the context of like climate movement, and all these movements, I think um, you mentioned like adjacent movements and adjacent efforts, but I really do believe that a lot of these things are intertwined,
Right.
and the silos are they're fake. They're just categories we put ourselves in for a lot of reasons, but they're not. They're ultimately just labels, and our efforts go across, and so does our storytelling inevitably. So it makes sense that justice leaders were saying that when you brought people to the table together, and I love that it started with a game. I'm into that, like the game night thing and the visioning sessions. Um, at Food Culture Collective, we lean into a lot of what we call radical imagination.
Right.
It's not something new, like it's just this practice, a collective practice of letting ourselves dream into the future together. And there's deep roots in actually Black feminism. You think about like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Octavia Butler, like all these folks who are leaders in Afrofuturism, basically like leading the way um, in storytelling, like through storytelling about like worlds where we're all free.
Yeah.
And it's like it's not even like a crazy idea. It's just a simple like underlying narrative, like what if, and a whole bunch of like a universe, multiple universes of stories that people can be inspired by and hang on to. And that honestly, I think it's a beautiful legacy and ongoing lineage because there's also people practicing this today. And I think for Food Culture Collective, we definitely take the framework of food and land and stuff. But I think there's a direct, it's like the same thing in a lot of
Yeah.
ways as climate fiction and climate storytelling. It's just what's your entry point into all of this, into thinking about the future. And I think I really, latched onto this like hope and joy over doom and gloom thing. But I think I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about like what you think like you would want to see more of in climate storytelling, because it sounds like Grist is doing a good job. Like you're all like, we're having this contest, we have this series, we're making the anthology, we're collecting these different flowers. I love that metaphor. What do you think can be pushed more in this realm?
Yeah, I think there's like two ways that we can push more in this realm. One of them is just that we need to, well, I'm going to actually make it three things. But the first one I'll say is we need more stories. And we need more stories from folks that are on the front lines of this. So folks in the developing world, folks that are here in the United States that are living on the front lines of this crisis
Mm-hmm.
and have um, been thinking through solutions and built in resiliency in their own communities just from trial and error and having to do so. I want to hear their stories and their fictional stories around what does the world look like and what is possible in this beautiful future that we could have if we get this right. So that's one thing, is just like we need more of these stories to kind of make it out there and be published, right? I already know the challenges of publishing a good story. You know, there's the artwork that has to be, you don't have to have artwork, but I think it's quite nice to have a beautiful illustrated cover to kind of pull it all together. So, you know, there's that cost. There's the cost of like paying the writer a fair wage, you know, so that writers themselves like can stay at this craft and it actually can be something that, you know, puts food in the refrigerator and pays to keep the lights on and more. So, you know, we have some knowledge around that, and I'd be happy to share that with others who are interested. But you know, making sure that that happens, like, so that there's just this pipeline of really beautiful stories. Like, can you know, we're one outlet, but I would love to see more of these stories being published in other spaces.
Yeah.
Another thing is moving this to other platforms, turning some of these stories into maybe anime. I know that my kids are really into anime, but a lot of the stories there are very dystopian, and you know, like very dystopian, like even more so than like what I grew up with. And I, you know, I love a good dystopian story, and some of my favorite stories are dystopian ones. But I just think that the balance has shifted so far that like it's just one dystopian and, you know, really bad story after another, full of trauma and violence and almost like apocalyptic. Like we're just so addicted to this idea of apocalypse, and I would love us to kind of move, you know, not even move away from that completely, but just like there be a lot more stories about what if we get it right. I love that you were like, what if? My favorite thing to do when I'm like walking my dog is what if? Like, I love what if, you know, and I think more people should play with the idea of what if in a variety of futures and ways. And then the third thing I think is like, there's an opportunity with technology. You know, we have all these different ways of communicating and modes of storytelling. I know that there's a new outfit called Agog from the founder of Grist, who left Grist not too long ago to pursue some new things. And the new thing that he had come up with is exploring how do you tell stories through using AR and VR. So augmented reality and virtual reality, which I think is interesting. I don't know how many, like, there's some interesting folks that are in those spaces, but I think more and more that's going to be a thing. So exploring that. Yeah, the places that we keep getting folks that are interested in prodding us is, hey, can we turn this into some streaming thing? Maybe there's like a green mirror that we can create.
That's awesome. Yeah, I could see how that's the big one that people are prodding about these days for expanding media. I think yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that, like, you know, a little list of stuff that you want to see. Which is great. I think generally it's, I think, a beautiful thing anytime we can share the stories more widely. I think it does that much more in shifting how we think of our culture in a lot of ways, because I do think right now we're definitely in a very like, it's hard to imagine something that's not horrible space. And I think a lot of our relationships present day are maybe, you know, that's information we're giving ourselves, right? About the state of things and how we want to change. And I think it's beautiful to um, basically want to prepare this. I'm going to do a garden metaphor here. Prepare the soil as best we can in all these different ways. Like, if I'm a novice gardener, all right, but I know you have to make healthy soil. You also have to like make sure there's like, you have to weed and be on top of it. So you have to do all of these different things, not just like put water on plants and give them sun.
And you can't do it alone.
Yeah, it has
You
to be,
garden,
like,
I think garden with a community.
yeah, and I think it's it's wonderful. I wanted to see, with just a couple minutes we have left, if you wanted to try a little bit of dreaming yourself with me. So Food Culture Collective has a little like orienting vision statement, and I guess the question around it is, when you let your imagine take you to a future, like let's say it's several generations from now, where our relationships with the land, the waters, our communities are nourished in care and reciprocity. instead of exploitation and extraction. What's a vision that comes to mind, or maybe a feeling you've got that comes up for you?
Yeah, for me, that vision includes lots of people that I care about and share values with, exploring the uncomfortable things, right? Or even the things that we don't talk about that often with people that are close to us. And so, for example, um, I remember years ago I was in Vermont, and there were a whole bunch of elders who were coming together to talk about how much their community has changed and reflecting on they're in a barn, and this great big old barn, and everybody brought like a potluck food leftovers from their house. It was basically bring your leftovers and let's talk about like everything that's changed and what we liked about the past and where we want to go. And I from being from the city and experiencing this moment, and I've been to community events, I've, you know, hung out with lots of different people to kind of discuss like, you know, how do we get right on our neighborhood in this neighborhood. But this was different in that they wanted to discuss hope for their community. And ever since then, I've been trying to have conversations with people around hope and what does it mean. And once you ask people that and you explore that, you there's a possibility for you to share something that is new and learn something new. And I say that because hope is a word that you don't really explore with people. Like if I could ask like maybe we do, maybe people, because I'm in this space, but if I start asking people outside of movement spaces, outside of storytelling, climate work, I think the conversation that we're having in these liberated, these beautiful climate storytelling, future looking spaces need to grow beyond just us, you know? And so I hope that in the future it's easy to have those and complex and hard conversations with people you don't know that well.
Mm, I love that. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful. That's juicy. Yeah, that reminds me. Maybe you'll be interested in this, but we're Food Culture Collective's running Food Futures Dream Lab event series where we're inviting people to grab people in their community, either in person or virtually, and thinking, like basically doing vision exercises and dreaming into that future and talking about that. What if, you know, things go well and all these we're able to make the shifts we need to make to face the challenges we have today, and the world is very different in 5, 6, 7 generations, and trying to do an imagination exercise together and then walking it back and be like, all right, how do we plant this right now? How do we, with dinosaurs we gotta sneeze on or whatever. So I feel like that I feel like we could definitely start doing more of that today, even just like with people, like, you know,
Yeah.
maybe it's a weird happy hour thing that we do. We're out and about with folks, or like a game night, who knows. So I'm gonna wrap us up. It's about time right now.
That's fine.
I think it's been really fun chatting with you, Tory. I actually wanted to give you some space to give some information about how folks can find out more about the Imagine 2200 series. I know there's an open call out right now.
Yeah, that's right. So just to back up a tiny bit, Imagine 2200 is a climate fiction initiative at Grist, which itself is a nonprofit that's focused on independent media. And we've been around for 25 years, but the project Imagine 2200 is only in its 4th year. And right now we're looking for climate fiction stories that are full of hope, climate solutions, cultural authenticity, and interesting characters. And the way that you can find Imagine is either just go to grist.org and look for the project Imagine 2200, or search Imagine 2200 2024. You'll get the latest call for submissions. So for the writers out there, you know, check out the prompt that we're putting out into the world and see if that's a story that you have in you that you want to write. And if it is, you can submit that story. You have about 65 days to write that story. So that's a decent amount of time, but you know, the story length is anywhere from 20 words to 5,000 words. And yeah, be wild with it, be fun with it. And it really, if you look back at the stories that we've published, they're a good barometer of what kind of stories we're looking for. We obviously don't want all of the same, but those stories do offer somewhat of a guide, and you'll be able to find those collections on the Grist website.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, I'll post a link on our link in bio and the info there too. We're doing, actually, if anybody is like experiencing writer's block, I encourage you to check out our Food Futures Dream Lab series, which basically, like, you can imagine with some other people in a group into the future, and maybe that could seed some story, or I don't know, get imaginative juices flowing. So more on that to come later the next few weeks. But I wanted to thank you, Tory. Thank you for folks who tuned in and sent us little waves and hearts and stuff. I think we're going to be doing a lot more thinking and basically like extended conversations and practice invitations for dreaming together in community. Because I think it's one thing to be like, I'm going to journal about this today.
Right.
And a different thing to be like, I'm going to talk about this with people and think about it together. So really appreciating the opportunity to do that with you today, Tory.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
And yeah, hopefully we can see a lot more stories come out of this. So say bye and happy storytelling, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Ada.
Okay.